and the policy and objectives that really guide us towards collaboration in this topic. Part of that background is talking about the Mexican spotted owl and give you just enough information so you can get where some of the issues and need for this discussion come from. And then specifically, we're going to dive into a case study on the Coconino fire and spend probably the bulk of our time on that and recommendations that we have at this point in terms of how we move forward. So it's not a surprise to anyone on this call, but the numbers of acres that are burning annually in terms of high severity fire continue to grow, and it's becoming more and more important for us to identify opportunities to use wildfire to meet multiple land management and resource objectives. And like I said, I don't think that's a surprise to anyone on this call, but it really lays the groundwork for where we are. And we have a lot of catching up to do. There's a lot of information to show how far behind we are in terms of reintroducing fire into these landscapes. Tessa Nicolay, who's the regional forest ecologist, has one analysis that says we should be burning over 1 million acres a year just to maintain these systems. So we're a little bit behind the 8 ball. And again, in terms of what those areas look like, we have a lot of highly stocked, dense forests that didn't used to be this way across such large expanses. And so part of the issue is, you know, how do we, with all of the things going on, get fire back into these systems and acting in a more natural way where we're not getting these big, large patches of high severity fire.
Yeah, so with that, you know, that kind of introduces the necessity of wildland fire management, implementing kind of a new concept of returning fire to the landscape. And a lot of fire managers that are on the call today are familiar with, you know, prescribed fire and how that helps us achieve objectives and kind of reintroduce fire onto this landscape to reduce the threat of this uncharacteristic wildfire. But that's not enough. We know that we don't have the amount of NEPA or the amount of money necessary to treat enough acres on the ground to really make a dent. And so we have to look at other opportunities. And fortunately for us, you know, wildfire can provide one opportunity to help achieve these types of objectives across the landscape. And if applied appropriately, given the right amount of effort and time and patience, I think it's a good way to move forward.
So in terms of policy that guides us in that direction, interagency cooperation and coordination is a major tenet of our national fire policy. And this bullet you see on the slide comes directly from that policy in terms of really encouraging, and not so much encouraging, but telling us that in order to meet resource objectives with fire, we should be collaborating with our partners and working together, both internally and externally, to meet those objectives. So that coordination with resource specialists and development of mutually agreed to objectives is really fundamental to being successful in achieving land and resource objectives with wildfire, and prescribed fire as well. So to give you some background and to have our obligatory beautiful wildlife photo in the presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about the Mexican spotted owl. That is the resource we're focusing on today in terms of an example of collaboration with external partners. Things you need to know about the Mexican spotted owl for this talk are that owls live in frequent and infrequent fire-adapted forests. So we're talking, you know, ponderosa pine, gamble oak, mixed conifer. And at this point in time, landscape scale, high severity fire, so we're talking about large patches of high severity fire, are just definitely the most serious threat to the owl and its habitat compared to other threats over the last 20 years. And when we revised the recovery plan in 2012, we most definitely identified it as the greatest concern in terms of future recovery for the species. Protected Activity Centers, or PACs, we'll probably use that term, those are management areas of about 600 acres that are designated around known owl nest and roost sites. And the owl breeding season goes from March 1st to August 31st, which overlaps with the fire season. And specifically, when we're talking about May through June being kind of the height of that opportunity sometimes to use fire, we're seeing is probably one of the most sensitive times for the owl. Birds typically breed in March, they incubate in April, eggs hatch out in May, and nestlings are on or near the nest through the first part of June. And the nestlings tend to stay within about 100 meters of their nest until early to mid-July, or until they can really fly and move about farther on their own. In addition, one of the reasons we're most concerned about this period of time is juvenile owls have a really low survival rate anyway, so the more obstacles we add to that first year of their life, the more difficult their road is to survival and becoming an adult that contributes to the population. So there's a lot of potential to negatively affect the success of breeding spotted owls in these fire-adapted systems. And this is one of the reasons we thought it was a great example to talk about in terms of how we coordinate and have close collaboration on fire management issues.
So it's pretty obvious, wildlife, or specifically the Mexican spotted owl, really can create kind of a negative, or how do I say this a little bit better? I guess as a
challenge?
A challenge, yeah, thank you, Shaula. A challenge to implementing wildfire across the landscape, or wildland fire, including prescribed fire. The bulk of its breeding season are in the core times for us to be, having wildfire and implementing prescribed fire. We do implement a lot of prescribed fire here on the Coconino and most of the Southwest in the fall, but that's just a limited window of opportunity. And as we spoke before, with all this catching up we have to do and how departed our ecosystems are from their natural function as fire as a disturbance, we're going to have to burn outside our traditional windows to achieve some of these acres and try to improve the forest resilience so that we aren't consistently losing this owl habitat due to large, high-severity, uncharacteristic wildfire events. And so on the screen here you see one of the case studies that we're going to talk about, and specifically on the Coconino National Forest, collaboration, what used to be called WUFU, or wildfire use, and now just wildfire, began in 2008 with the implementation of the new National Fire Plan that came out fiscal year 2009. And Coconino has taken a real progressive stance, trying to introduce as much wildfire or fire in general as we can across the landscape to achieve the objectives like we just spoke about. The number of acres of wildlife habitat is increasing, of wildfire in owl habitat is increasing over time. So like Shaula mentioned, we're losing this owl habitat due to these large wildfire events, and that habitat takes a long time to replace. A lot of those habitat characteristics are old-growth, dense stands that have a lot of large snags, large trees, large oaks. Those don't, just grow overnight, and so they're habitat characteristics that we don't have a lot of across the landscape. And so the more that we lose per year, the less owl habitat we have in the future, and the less likelihood that the owl gets delisted.
Yeah, and that we meet recovery. And in 2016 alone, we worked on about 30 fires across the three-state area, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, that were being managed for multiple objectives, specifically spotted owls. In varying cases, those had varying results because of a lot of things that impact fire on the ground. But today specifically, we're going to talk about the Camille fire.
So the Camille fire occurred kind of in the central portion of the Coconino National Forest, kind of on our eastern boundary of the ponderosa pine that goes out into our more grass and PJ type ecosystem. But we had some critical infrastructure in that area of concern, and so we had to decide how to balance protecting the critical infrastructure with this wildfire and wildlife habitat and to do the right thing on the ground. We had a unique opportunity where we had some increased moisture over the winter and the spring that produced less than characteristic fire season for us. And when I say that, I mean, you know, we had a lower fire danger and less occurrence of human-caused wildfires and less resistance to control than we typically had this time of year. This wildfire occurred in early summer when typically we you know, it's kind of all hands on deck, and we're trying to suppress every wildfire as small as possible because that resistance to control and the potential for high severity wildfire during that time of year is typically very high. And so this was a unique opportunity to get some fire on the landscape under conditions that were similar to what we would consider a prescribed fire prescription in the fall and really do some good on the ground. It just so happened that we had multiple packs within the planning area, and that's kind of the area that we assess for the potential for wildfire to move to across the landscape. And so we had to come to agreement on how we were going to approach achieving the objectives and how we were going to prioritize those objectives and values so that we could achieve what we needed to on the ground. And that's where Shaula comes in with the packs.
So working with the Coconino biologists on the Flagstaff Ranger District, we worked together with fire to identify the boundary that they were looking at for the fire, and we knew that there were 12 protected activity centers within that area. 5 of them were also part of a management experiment that we're working with on Forefry. So we did not want to burn those as part of this project, and so that became information that was valuable in terms of moving forward. But on the rest of them, the process was if we didn't already have information on their breeding status, we got out quickly to try and determine that status so we could make a decision on, and know more specifically, how we might be impacting those birds that season, or if there'd be an opportunity to avoid some areas where birds may be nesting versus not nesting, and things like that. We also were able to provide some information in terms of on-the-ground knowledge of those pack areas in terms of heavy fuel loading and other things that were beneficial for those conversations with fire and how we might approach management in those areas.
So the Camille fire directly, the ignition was naturally caused, of course, lightning, and that's why we were able to achieve the objectives that we did. But apart from that, it started in an area where we did have previous mechanical and wildfire treatment, and actually a pretty decent history of that. A lot of the areas where the ignition started had seen prescribed fire at least twice, if not 3 times, over the last 20 years. And so fuel conditions were different in where the ignition was compared to the packs and some of the other areas that we were considering allowing wildfire to move towards the south as we progressed. And so the fuel dynamic definitely changed. The picture that you see was kind of reminiscent of the ignition area. You know, you see a lot of kind of knee-high tall green grass, not a lot of heavy down and dead fuel, and that wasn't consistent across the entire planning area. You know, we went into some areas where we had higher elevation, and by that I just mean kind of a fuel type change from ponderosa pine to a little bit more mixed conifer type ecosystem, and a series of different changes in fuels. So we went from anywhere from 3 to 5 tons per acre to an estimated of over 40 to 50 tons per acre, and probably higher than that in some areas. And so it really presents a challenge on the ground when you're trying to look at these wildfire events as potential opportunities to achieve objectives and get fire in the landscape. And then you have to start considering all the different types of resource areas and objectives that you may want to achieve or have to protect in order to achieve your objectives. So like I mentioned, there was some infrastructure type values in this burn. One of those was a major power line corridor that runs north-south from Flagstaff to Phoenix, and that provides Phoenix some critical electricity during the hottest time of the year. This was in May, June fire, and that, you know, in Phoenix at that time of year, temperatures can be well over 100, sometimes upwards of 120 degrees, and losing power on that power line due to a wildfire event could be catastrophic. And so we had to apply some protection objectives, but include these resource objectives also that include, fuel, hazardous fuels reduction. We looked at, of course, the wildlife habitat component of it that we're talking about now. Those are critical. That's a critical habitat in this area that we normally don't have the opportunity to introduce fire into. And so balancing that out was definitely a challenge for this specific fire.
So and ultimately on this fire, there were 2 protected activity centers that we determined the birds were non-nesting and were part of the burning process. One of those packs contained a lot of the fuel loading that Wes was talking about, and so that took, or was going to take, very specific operations, fire ops, and tactics in order to introduce fire into that area so we didn't completely lose or modify the habitat those birds were using, particularly in an important roost area for the birds that had a lot of heavy fuel on the ground. And so as part of this, both of those 2 packs, fire was introduced into as part of this fire.
And as Shaula mentioned, there was 12 packs total within the planning area and only 2 burned. And that's part of that coordination that went on. Shaula actually and some of the district wildlife folks were able to go in and actually do surveys pre-fire moving into that pack to help us determine whether or not those owls might be breeding. And that really helped us decide how we were going to allow fire to move across the landscape and what our protection objectives were going to be. So we definitely used existing roads and features in addition to some protection line that we put in to avoid some of the packs because those birds were breeding. And then other areas where the birds were not showing those signs of breeding, we were able to actually introduce wildfire on our terms and try to reduce the fuel loading in there and protect that habitat in the future. And that's real key.
So giving you that background in terms of the story and the fire and what happened, we're going to kind of dive into the recommendations that we have at this point in time. And some of these have been built on with fires since the 2015 Camino fire. But, and I'll let Wes start on this. But these are some places we've gotten in terms of steps we think people can take to be successful in using fire during the owl breeding season in a way that does meet all the resource objectives we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, so I'll go through these recommendations and then Shaula can provide some extra on there. But so one of the big things that we recommend is to really plan ahead. And by that, I mean pre-season, pre-fire, over the winter when not a lot's going on and your mind's kind of off fire and more on hunting or spending time with your family or whatnot. That's really the key time to start approaching and looking at introducing wildfire or wildland fire management in general in these habitat types and areas that are real departed and need wildfire. And we do that every year. We take some time and we coordinate with our district folks. We coordinate with folks from Fish and Wildlife like Shaula and some other organizations to really try to identify pre-season where we would consider reintroducing wildfire, where we can achieve those objectives on the ground, if there's areas where we may not want wildfire or fire in general. There's some research packs that I'll let Shaula talk about currently on the Coconino where we're trying to do some research for the owl and we don't want fire on those packs right now. So those are areas where we want to make sure we have protection objectives identified ahead of time, and that pre-planning that goes on has to be communicated to all fire folks on the district or across the force. Everybody from the GS3 first-year firefighter all the way up to the fire staff, everybody has to have the same level of understanding on how we are implementing fire on this forest or other forests and what those objectives are going to be for the year.
The only other thing I would add to that is, that time when you're planning ahead gives you some opportunity to explain the why behind a lot of, why you may want to protect some areas from fire, or, where we want to go, or why owl biology in this case, for this example, is important. Your resource may change, but that gives you that time. You're not under the gun or in the moment having to explain to people why something might be important.
The next recommendation is to have an interdisciplinary WFDIS team. And for those of you that may not know, WFDIS stands for Wildfire Decision Support System. It is a web-based tool that fire managers, particularly federal fire managers, are mandated to use to document objectives, courses of action, and rationale behind wildfire events, particularly larger wildfire events or ongoing wildfire events. And so what I mean by interdisciplinary WFDIS is, by standards of the documentation for the system, you only have to have one author and one approver to document that decision. But that doesn't really do justice if you're trying to achieve a lot of objectives across the landscape. It's better if you hold a interdisciplinary district level or forest level, even multiple forest or multiple district level interdisciplinary team, where you bring all areas of different resources on board to talk about their concerns, the objectives they would like to achieve, whether or not we need to identify additional protection objectives. We can talk about the courses of action and kind of the planning area of where we think this wildfire might go and what we want to look at. And then that helps you define a real strong rationale on why you're doing what you're doing. And that really helps you communicate that, going back to the kind of plan ahead portion. If you have a strong pre-planning and then you go towards your wildfire event and you have a strong planning in the initial stages of that wildfire event, you really do have a clear communication device moving forward.
So you want to...
Yeah, I can talk about this a little bit too. So Coconino, there's some other forests that do this also, but the Coconino really takes time to prioritize our values at risk. And it's a very difficult thing to do, and it takes a lot of time and effort in communicating why we do it to get everybody on board. But when I talk about prioritization, obviously first priority every wildfire event is public and firefighter safety, and firefighter safety comes first. And then oftentimes your protection objectives come second. Of what critical infrastructure or private residents are in the area where that property needs to be protected from the fire. And then after that comes, the values that you are trying to enhance or protect in the future. And you really need to be able to articulate that and prioritize those objectives so that can flow through the WFDIS document and benefits how you communicate that on the ground. If everybody knows that owl habitat is priority number 4, then everybody understands that if they can only achieve priorities 1 through 5, that then the owl habitat is within those priorities. If you can only achieve 1 and 2, then you know that public and firefighter safeties are those priorities. And so it helps you on the fly as wildfire changes and wildfire management changes as you move across a different organization, that your priorities can change, and having those values prioritized is really effective.
So the next one is having clear objectives, and I can't stress how important I think this one is. You really need detailed and quantifiable objectives, particularly since those can really feed into your post-fire monitoring, so you can document success or what happened as a result of the action. This also provides the linkage back to your WFDIS document, so you can show you met the objectives that you've identified in there. A lot of times we'll see objectives that are like promote ecosystem health, and that's not probably as specific as I think can be useful to helping people plan tactics and how to approach certain areas depending on whether it's infrastructure, owls, or whatever. the more specific and quantifiable this can be, the better chance you'll have of showing whether or not you met those goals later.
Yeah, it goes back also to that prioritization of values. That's how you start out planning an event like this, is where are those values. Next comes the objectives of what you're trying to protect or enhance and why. And then after that, directly attached, one for one, all the way through, is your course of actions directly tied to objectives. So you know what the value is, you know why you need to do what you need to do, now how are you going to do it. And if you have all that packaged together, it really does improve this process for everybody.
And then line officer understanding is really, really important. So you want that bottom-up discussion that comes up to the line officers so they hear both fire and resource specialists and understand where they're coming from and what their issues are. If you have line that doesn't understand what those issues are for the different resource groups, then they may be reluctant to support specific actions or even the entire event moving forward. And so the more clearly we can communicate with decision makers on, how values were prioritized, what the objectives are, and why those things may be important, the more successful and the more support you're going to have moving forward. And then this is my probably my favorite one. I think one of the issues with fire over time has been we're always in a hurry to get it down quickly and move forward. And I cannot stress enough, I think we have a real opportunity with fire events to be patient. And if we're really going to use fire to meet multiple resource objectives, then we really need to be willing to respond and act accordingly as fire weather changes, as resource and personnel availability changes. There's always this perception of if you prolong this fire or if it goes longer than the standard 2 weeks, then we're wasting resources and those could be elsewhere and we could be doing something else. And I think ultimately we're really only going to be successful in getting fire back out on the ground if we give ourselves the time and the ability to be successful. Some of these fires you can, tie up relatively quickly, but some of them maybe not so much, and maybe you're going to be more successful if you give it a little bit of time and either let things dry out, or if you have an opportunity for conditions to maybe get a little wetter in some areas where you have higher fuel loads. But that patience factor is really, really important, and it's probably one of the harder things to achieve because some of that is out of a lot of our control for a lot of the resource specialists, both fire managers and resource specialists on the ground. That is a line officer decision a lot of the time, how much time you have on a given event. But I think it gets back to everything we've talked about in terms of recommendations, the planning ahead, the interdisciplinary wildfire decision support system, that prioritization of values and clear objectives, and then communicating that to line, not just during the event, but prior to the event when you've got their full attention.
So the next piece is after the event occurs, and documenting how you met your objectives and why. And I think as the Forest Service and a lot of federal agencies, we fail at this a lot of the times, unfortunately. We'll report the minimal that we have to get the accomplishments in the systems, and that's kind of where it ends. But it's really important to capture your successes. Those aren't communicated very regularly, and I think we can all learn from others' successes. I know that a lot of other forests have had successes, and I've talked with other forests on their successes and tried to work those into some of my and on our planning on this forest. And then your lessons learned. So you don't always have all successes. Every wildfire event has lessons learned. You need to share those with other folks. You need to share those with the rest of the forest, with the region, nationally, so that everybody can learn from what you achieved on the ground and what you did and move forward. And that helps building the relationship and the trust. If you're sharing your lessons learned and sharing your successes, sharing how you achieved objectives on the ground, that helps everybody involved understand that you really do care for more than just your resource or your function. And then that helps you build your adaptive management practices. And so every year changes. Every year changes for the Coconino, and it should, after I'm long gone, every year we should build on what we achieved the year prior and keep moving forward and make sure that that's documented and shared.
And I think with that, we're ready for any questions people might have.
Well, excuse me. Thank you so much, guys. That was a great presentation. I really love those recommendations, and I can't resist saying, just from my perspective, it was neat seeing how some of these recommendations coming out of sort of a partnership between fire and wildlife mirror some things I've heard from partnerships between the fire shop and kind of cultural resources or archaeology. So neat to see some parallels there. So we may be able to unmute the line. We don't have too many people on the line, but go ahead and type questions in to the chat box if they're top of mind. We'll start with some from Jeannie. Jeannie asked, how many people or groups are involved in the coordination, and how often do you meet? And then maybe a sort of part of that same question is, who coordinates the group? Who runs the planning? And I believe that's kind of linked to that multidisciplinary WWFDIS idea.
Yeah, so starting with kind of the second question of who runs the planning and how often do you meet, I guess that's both questions. I'm looking at them. We meet more than once a year. So the winter time is really time to reflect on what happened the year prior, to build those lessons learned, and to start planning for the future. In the springtime, early spring, I'm talking prior to fire season, we hold what I call WWFDIS refreshers every year on each district. And so that's typically line officer driven. They set up a scenario, I come down as a facilitator, and we have a discussion with those resource folks on if we had it, we do a what if scenario. And so if we had a wildfire here, what would we need to protect? What would we like to enhance? What would we like to achieve for the future? And we do that every year for every district. And then you have your wildfire events, and that happens, as far as often, however many you have for a year. I've done so many as 10 or 12 for one district in a year, and I've done as few as 0 or 1, So it definitely varies from year to year as far as how often you meet during the wildfire season. And then as far as who coordinates the planning, I think everybody has a responsibility in this, and not every one person can be a coordinator. I think if a resource feels like they need to have a discussion, then they should bring it forward to fire, and I feel like fire has some responsibility in trying to coordinate and communicate this annually. From my position as the fire and fuels planner on the Coconino, I'm responsible for the preseason coordination, those WWFDIS refreshers, and then ensuring that we do document and get a WWFDIS decision document on these wildfires. That's my priorities in my portion of this coordination. The line officer is ultimately responsible for setting up the meeting. For us, as far as the number of people involved, it is as many people as we can pack into a room. We like to get as many folks from the resource area or various resource areas in the room to have that conversation, and it makes things real transparent. And we have, some of our WWFDIS, they take multiple days, especially when you start off. I've had some WWFDIS decisions take 2 or 3 days to fully work through all the concerns. As you build trust and relationship over time, those meetings get a lot faster, and the amount of pre-planning you put in pre-season equals time and I guess during the season. And so if you put forth the effort to do that pre-planning, your WWFDIS, interdisciplinary WWFDIS meetings become shorter. Does that answer the question?
Yes.
All right.
Yeah, so Jeannie wrote in to say, great, thank you. Yeah, interesting. I think you, one thing I pulled out of what you just said is that you might feel like you're investing time up front, but there's a payoff down the line. And I wonder, another one of your recommendations was around connecting with decision makers, and I wonder if there's a similar pattern there where talking with line officers and building trust and building understanding pays off over time. Do you guys want to comment on that at all?
Yeah, to start off, I think one of the biggest things, if you're starting fresh with new line officers in a new organization, is start small. If you have small successes initially, that builds trust, and you can build upon those small events, and you can, I guess, progress the organization towards these. I consider the Coconino Fire 23,885 acres a relatively large event for the Coconino National Forest, and that has taken a number of years to build that level of trust and understanding with our line officers. And line officers change. Since I've been here, we only have one line officer still on the district that was here originally when I started as the fire and fuels planner. And so you have to be flexible and approach every line officer with kind of a fresh eyes and ears of seeing where they're at as far as understanding fire and ecosystem and where you are, and it boils down to having a conversation. It really does. Pre-planning ahead of the season, sit down and talk with your line officers, figure out what their comfort level is, kind of communicate and facilitate that lessons learned from past events. If you can share and you have well-documented past events, you can share those with the line officers when they first come on board. That helps build that relationship, and helps you achieve your objectives.
The other thing we've tried to do the last several years, and actually we were better about this a long time ago, and then there was kind of a lull, and then we're kind of back in the mode, is having a fish and wildlife biology fire with line officer meeting early in the season before the season gets going, and that gives us a chance, biologists, to spend some time making sure we've got all the data updated in the databases and have some discussion with fire pre-season. Some of that's been really enhanced by the forest planning information and the management experiments we have planned looking at fire effects to owls in some of this area. But I think the more you can make those interdisciplinary, the better. In northern Arizona, there's others, Ponderosa Fire Advisory Council, that's where another example of where that pre-planning and relationship building is occurring across the board with other disciplines, between fire, between communities, community government. And I think we just need to think bigger in terms of who needs to be at the table, and maybe not all at the same table on the same day, but definitely in that pre-season, making sure you're meeting and talking to the people you need to be successful, whether it's a wildfire that you need to fully suppress, or if there's an opportunity to really use a lightning-caused ignition to reintroduce fire.
Thanks. So if you're listening in, please do type in questions or comments. I wanted to kind of dive into a comment that Wes made, and I'm going to actually take advantage of a past presentation. It might be interesting for people to see. This is the ravage data for the Coconino Fire, and Wes mentioned documenting kind of past successes, and it may not be the perfect way, but the map hopefully you're seeing now of the Coconino Fire was from the fire season overview that the consortium produced. And I hope that document is one way to have easy kind of documentation of past fire season. It only covers sort of the biggest fires, but it's one way to kind of have some of this information, and they're archived on the consortium website. So, in this case, if you wanted to go back and sort of show off the Camillo fire. At least some of the information is there. And that actually leads into a question that I had from the presentation. Wes, you showed the Jack Fire wildfire outcome report, and I'm guessing this is sort of more of an internal document, but what are the kind of, I don't know, pros and cons or challenges and opportunities of making those sorts of reports more public? I know sort of sitting in an NGO, I don't necessarily have access or get to see some of those outcome reports or the, I think what used to be called fuel treatment effectiveness reports. But I think that those can be an opportunity to build learning and understanding kind of beyond the agency. So
yes, Xander, so
that out there.
Okay, so wildfire outcome reports and fuel treatment effectiveness reports are actually two separate documents. I guess I'll just start with that one. Wildfire outcome reports are a report that our Region 3 requires for us to claim acres as being a benefit or an accomplishment on the hazardous fuel side of I guess, the shop. And so what this report does is it basically takes our objectives that we develop in our WFDS, and we go through line by line and we address exactly how the wildfire met that objective. And where we can, we add, physical documentation. We write narratives. You can see this MSO pack analysis that shows, based on ravage data, that shows how much of, how much effect we had in those packs. And so you can see the Bargaman, Power, and Wingfield pack there in that little, I guess, clip. It may be kind of hard to see. But as you can see in there, the bulk of that pack specifically burned in very low, and the rest of it was, or the bulk of it, of the other part of it was in the low. And so it's just, the wildfire outcome report is a Forest Service and I guess Region 3 specific report where we document those objectives that we met. I'd be more than happy to share those with the consortium. They're not a classified document by any means. It's something that our line officer does approve of, and so once she signs off on our accomplishments for the year, then we can release all that documentation. It's not, like I said, sensitive by any means. And then a fuels treatment effectiveness report, just to tag on, that's how we document when a wildfire interacts with a prior fuels treatment, and specifically something that's either mechanical or prescribed fire driven for those events. And so those are two different reports, two different, I guess, reporting systems that we use.
Great. Well, I'm glad I asked because I had them totally confused. Carl from the Santa Fe has a question, so I'm going to go ahead and unmute the phone so he can kind of articulate it more easily. So, Carl, we should be able to hear you now.
Hey, everybody. This is Andre Silva, and I am with Carl here. We both work on the Santa Fe National Forest for the Southwest Jemez Collaborative Project. Anyways, I wanted to kind of gear the question towards Shaula and also of some of the wildlife folks there that may have helped with this fire example that you just gave. Specifically, I want to know what types of vegetation monitoring within the packs may have been conducted prior to that burn and post. And so I just kind of want to get an idea of what's been done in that neck of the woods as we need to kind of apply some of that to this project soon.
Well, so it depends. I mean, for just general protected activity center habitat on the landscape, mostly what we use is the remote sensing data, whether it's bark or otherwise, to get that general overview. If it's an area that we're looking at more intensively in terms of like some of the management experiment packs as a part of FORFRI, we have permanent vegetation plots in those packs so we can measure pre and post vegetation in there. So it depends on your objective. There's obviously, as you know, Andre, way too many sites for us to do that kind of intense monitoring across the board. But if we can identify some sites where we can collect more detailed information, I think that's really helping, or that's really helpful towards providing better information to fire too, in terms of not only what the conditions are pre-fire, but what they are post-fire, and maybe what we want to do differently if we introduce fire into a similar area.
Well, thank you, Shaula. I just thought it might be beneficial to us to have the protocol that you guys are collecting more detailed vegetation.
Sure.
Because this is a really good time for me to start collecting that data. I have the means to do that the next couple of years, and we do plan on burning packs eventually, and I think next fiscal year. I'm not sure if that's going to be quite enough data, but it's probably better to get some than zero. But
absolutely, and I can share that with you.
Okay, that'd be excellent. Thank you.
I'll email it to you.
Okay, thank you.
Wow, it's like collaboration, right in action. I'm witnessing it. That's great. Other questions or comments? It looks like Brandon has a question, and he asks, how do specialists feel about using managed fire versus prescribed fire to meet resource objectives? And I can't, just because people, Frankie Romero from the WO Forest Service always yells at me about this. We're not supposed to use managed fire, right, Shaula? We have some other term now? Just wildfire?
Well, we do, but I think we all know what he means. We make it so complicated to talk about fire. I think they are both fire events with opportunities. One typically occurs during a different time of the year if we're using naturally ignited fire to meet objectives versus prescribed fire. We've kind of narrowed the window in the past to when we do prescribed fire to being in the fall, so I think there may be some perceptions about effects that occur with prescribed fire that may not always be true. If we could expand that window and operate maybe more when we've got higher humidities and maybe a little more moisture in the system before we introduce fire. But I judge them less on managed fire versus prescribed fire and more on what are the conditions and what is our goal with introducing fire at that particular time.
And with that, I'll just add that, managed fire, or as we were supposed to call it, wildfire, naturally ignited wildfire, is still an emerging event. And so the amount of pre-planning you can do, like we spoke earlier, really helps with that, acceptance for using wildfire. Prescribed fire, there is a concerted amount of effort, pre-planning just by nature, in developing the NEPA, working on the implementation plan, developing your burn plan. Everybody knows what's going to happen on the ground well before it occurs. Wildfire, you don't always have that opportunity, and so it really comes down to that concerted amount of pre-planning, pre-season, to really determine and to get that, agreement on how to proceed with fire.
But I would stress to that, and we tried to make this point, that there is so much more pre-planning we could do for wildfire than we do across the board, I think. And that will set us up for more success. A lot of times in the last, 10, 20 years, I think we acted as if it was always going to be a surprise that we may have an opportunity. And I think we need to be a lot more strategic about the opportunity is going to come. Are we going to be ready for it? And what do we need to do to be ready for it?
I think that's very wise. Certainly from my slightly removed position, it certainly seems like the opportunities are going to come. Other questions or comments here? We're probably wrapping up, getting towards the end of the hour, but we probably have time for one more question or comment, and the phone line is open, so you can just say it. Well, maybe this is a good opportunity to thank you again, Shaula and Wes. I think it was a fascinating topic and clearly generated a lot of interest. As I mentioned earlier on, we'll record this webinar, or we have been recording this webinar, so you can share it with your colleagues if you found it useful. And I think we've been talking internally within the consortium about maybe following up this webinar with some others in the spring maybe based on some of the panel discussion at the Wildlife Society meeting early in the fall that I think Shaula and maybe Wes too was involved in. So thanks again, guys. I really appreciate it. Great presentation, fascinating to me, and I look forward to hopefully as participants, you guys can all join us again on future webinars like in 2 weeks when we talk about public perceptions of smoke. Thanks.
Thanks, Sander. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, guys.